All right, so this will be a recorded lesson on everything for the rest of genetics. So we will be talking about genetic disorders. This is what we did on Tuesday. So if anybody missed class any day the week of March 2nd, this will be everything for the rest of genetics. So starting with what is a genetic disorder. So we've been discussing what genetic disorders are sort of off and on. One of the causes of genetic disorders are DNA mutations, like what we're doing with our plants. Genetic disorders can also be caused by mistakes in meiosis, which results in the normal number of chromosomes not being correct. And we'll talk about these all in more detail. Disorders can also be caused by inheriting either a dominant or a recessive allele for that disorder. So just like any genetic trait that we've been discussing, if someone inherits the dominant allele for a disorder or the recessive allele for a recessive disorder, they're going to inherit that disorder just like any trait, dominant and recessive, that we've been discussing. And then the final one is caused by inheriting the same thing, a dominant or recessive allele, on the X chromosome, which is a sex-linked trait. So in this karyotype, it's called, in this karyotype, this individual has an extra chromosome, number 21, which actually results in Down syndrome, which is a genetic disorder. These frogs and other reptiles have extra limbs. These are DNA mutations. And albinism, which is a disorder which results in lack of pigment in the skin, is a recessive genetic disorder. So we're going to start off with the chromosome disorders. These are the ones when an incorrect number of chromosomes is inherited from the parents. If you have the notes sheet, the worksheet, you can fill it in. If not, just listen, and I can give you the notes worksheet when I see you next in class. And some examples here of chromosome genetic disorders are Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, and XYY syndrome. So what's interesting about these, in males and females, if you remember, right, the genotype for females is going to be XX. The genotype for males is going to be XY. So in an individual with Turner syndrome, she only has one X. She's missing one of her X chromosomes. Down syndrome is an extra copy of chromosome 23. Klinefelter syndrome affects males, and the males have an extra X chromosome. And in XYY syndrome, the males have an extra Y chromosome. And these affect sort of how an individual will go through puberty and have some effects on them, on their phenotype. So here's an example again of that extra chromosome there, number 21. And here, this person is missing chromosome 14. All right, so Down syndrome is an example. This is a famous actress. She was in Kindergarten Cop, and she has Turner syndrome. So she never, usually people with Turner syndrome will have shorter height, shorter stature in terms of their development. This is an individual cartoon with Klinefelter syndrome, and here is an XYY, extra Y chromosome. So dominant and recessive genetic disorders are going to be inherited the same way as our regular dominant and recessive traits have been inherited. So to get a recessive genetic disorder, just like any recessive trait, offspring would need to inherit two copies of a recessive allele. So if we used an R to represent the disorder, two little r's would mean you have it. However, if someone is heterozygous, big R, little r, we say that they're a carrier. Now, a carrier can pass the disease on to their children. However, they are normal. They don't show any symptoms of the disease. And some examples here of recessive genetic disorders are cystic fibrosis, which affects the lungs, albinism, which affects the skin, coloring, and Tay-Sachs disease, which affects the lysosomes in brain cells. It's a neurological disorder. On the other hand, we have dominant genetic disorders, which are inherited with dominant alleles. So if a person, an individual, inherits just one dominant allele for a dominant genetic disorder, then they have the disorder. And some examples, before we get to examples, I'm sorry, there are no carriers for dominant diseases. If you have the dominant allele, you have it, no matter what that second allele is. Remember, dominant, just like with dominant traits, if you have the big letter in the genotype, then you have the disorder, and that's that. There's no carriers for dominant genetic diseases, so you need to remember that. Carriers are only in recessive diseases, right? And that makes sense, because a recessive trait can be carried without being expressed. A dominant trait or a dominant allele, you have it or you don't. There's no carrying it or getting masked. And some examples, here they are, of dominant diseases are Huntington's disease, which we saw in the video a few weeks ago, Marfan syndrome, which makes an individual's extremities, like their hands or feet, their legs, get longer. And achondroplasia, which is kind of the opposite of that, is a type of inherited dwarfism. So these two kids have albinism, so their skin tone is lighter. They need to take protective precautions by wearing a hat, sunglasses, to protect their skin from sunburn. Here we have a lung that's affected with cystic fibrosis. Notice that the mucus is building up in the lungs, and that's what happens if someone has cystic fibrosis. Their lungs will fill up with mucus. This little boy has Tay-Sachs disease, and Tay-Sachs is a neurological disorder where the lysosomes cannot break down food in the cells. So this little boy, unfortunately, will not live past the age of 2 or 3. This family here might look familiar to you from TLC show Little People, Big World. So both of these parents have achondroplasia, inherited dwarfism. They have 4 children, and only one of their children is affected with the disorder. This is a dominant disorder. So anyone that has it has the dominant allele. They don't have it, they don't have the dominant allele. They're homozygous recessive. Okay, so we know that the parents must be heterozygous in order to have 3 normal children and 1 child that is affected. Okay, kind of interesting to think about that 2 parents that have achondroplasia would end up having most of their kids being average height. And then here's a young man with Marfan syndrome, excuse me. And notice that his fingers, his arms are longer, right? He's going to be taller height in general for Marfan syndrome. All right, so those are your dominant and your recessive genetic disorders.